You're listening to the Recovered Life Show, the show that helps people in recovery live their best recovered lives. And here is your host, Damon Frank.
And welcome back to the Recovered Life Show. Today we're talking about finding your purpose in recovery. My guest today is Dakota Vanidestine, a counselor for Crave Consulting in Texas. Dakota assists individuals in improving their emotional and mental health. Welcome to the show, Dakota.
Thank you. Honored to be here, and thank you for having me.
You know what? I think I actually slaughtered your last name. I'm historic, Dakota, for mispronouncing people's last names. So if I did, I apologize. Do you want to say it the correct way?
It's Dakota Vanidestine, but no worries at all. Yeah, it gets butchered all the time.
You know what? I went over it 4 or 5 times and I still didn't get it right. So that's my dyslexic self there. Welcome to the show, Dakota. I'm so glad to have you. We're talking about understanding your purpose, finding your purpose, a really big deal with people who are in addiction recovery. And I was excited to have this episode because this is something that you focus on as a mental health counselor, really helping people find their purpose. Can we start, Dakota, with what is purpose? Because I think a lot of people might be confused. They say, well, I think I have a purpose, but I still really feel lost. What does it mean when you say, Dakota, finding your purpose?
Yeah, so purpose and meaning, I tend to use them as synonyms when I approach counseling, but they've been defined in different ways. So oftentimes purpose is kind of this grand calling, really, and then meaning is more so the feeling you get from it. I feel a sense of meaning when I do things that align with my purpose, this grand kind of calling in life. So really, that's what it is. It's kind of very abstract, and that's why so many people struggle with it. So really, it's an individual active process, kind of searching out your meaning, searching out your purpose in life. And really, it's not my job as a counselor to define that for you. It's helping you kind of peel back the layers, understand yourself, which is something that we'll talk about, because that really is important when it comes to meaning. Who are you and what do you want to do and make of your life? So that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, I love that. I think many people, when they first get sober, we have a lot of people listen to the show that are in early recovery. And when they first get sober, they feel very lost. They feel that maybe they had a purpose, but now that they've sobered up and they've gone through the first part of the recovery process, they're like, you know what? I didn't really want to be an accountant, or I didn't want to, maybe I want a relationship, or I don't want to live in the town that, right? They just don't even have any driving force, and they feel a little bit untethered, and I think a lot of time people say, don't worry, you're going to find a purpose. You'll find a purpose somewhere, and a lot of times in recovery, it's service is people's first purpose. How important is purpose in somebody's mental health and recovery process? It's not healthy for people just to be untethered and have no purpose, right?
Again, it's difficult. And I'm going to speak in terms, as we go throughout this conversation, in terms of kind of my lens and how I approach counseling. And it's really going to be individual, and that's what we focus on in session. But I would say, according to how I approach counseling, is extremely important. So my orientation is existential. So focusing on the big question: what is your meaning? What is your purpose? Things like mortality, the deep stuff in life. And so I would say it's extremely important. And it's come up in pretty much every single counseling session I've been in, regardless of what they're going through, whether it be recovery, whether it be depression, anxiety, things like that. So it's kind of this overarching question that everyone at some point kind of faces. And if you haven't faced it, I would like to talk to you and figure out how that hasn't come up in your life,
Yeah, I love that. What are, Dakota, I know a lot of people are listening to this and saying, well, you know what? I've kind of tried to find my purpose and I just am lost kind of doing it. I know I had to redefine my purpose, 30 years ago when I got sober. I think back, and it was honestly very traumatic. I mean, it doesn't sound like a big deal, honestly, when you think about it, but really when you get in, when you feel a little lost, what are some of the challenges that people face when they're trying to find their purpose? What are some of those issues, those roadblocks that people hit?
Yeah, so I kind of alluded to it earlier, and now's probably a good time to talk about it. It's figuring out who they are. So one of my favorite quotes from late philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche is "Become who you are." So who are you, right? Getting into that question, and most people, they don't know. So we get into things like value work. What are your values? Most people, regardless of, again, kind of their symptomology, I think people are really distracted right now and not focusing enough inward. And a lot of people, I don't think there's been anyone in the time that I've been in my practice that can answer that question definitively. What are your values? So really getting into some of that and then using that as really your anchor point that grounds you to your sense of self, and then figuring out how you can fit those values into your everyday life. And usually purpose will kind of come from that. And another question I like to ask when figuring out values and kind of discovering that is, I'll ask, think of someone who you admire. Who is that person? And then what about them do you admire? And usually it's a certain set of qualities, and that usually aligns with their personal values. And that's really where I like to start, figuring out that sense of self. Without all the masks. Carl Jung talks about it, the persona, who we are when we're out in public. And when that doesn't align with your true sense of self, that's incongruence. And it causes a variety of problems when you don't feel like you can be your authentic self. So really digging into that, figuring out what that means for the individual.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's interesting because when you're talking about this, Dakota, I'm kind of thinking about the whole early recovery process is really kind of finding your purpose, because I know a lot of people, in recovery come in because they thought they had certain values, like I'm never going to drink and drive. I'm never going to drink at work. I'm not going to use this type of drugs. I'm not going to participate in this type of activity. And they find themselves doing this, and there's a shattering, right, of who they think they are and who they really are. And as that starts to come together, right, it brings up a lot of problems, a lot of mental health problems. And obviously, hopefully, it's moving people towards recovery. That maybe one of the reasons I can't really, set my values straight is because I'm addicted to a substance, right? And I have to address that, right? So when you're going through this field of kind of trying to find out what your values are and what your values are not, and you're using this modeling that you're saying from people, what are some of the common things that you want to stay away from? Because I think I know for me, I looked at certain things that I thought I wanted, but then as I started to pursue them, I was like, you know what? I don't really want that. Right? That's not really what I want. Is there like some sort of checklist that you use to kind of reframe your values? Or is this just something that you talk out with people?
Yeah, usually talk out. So I'll ask that powerful question, what are your values? And again, most people can't describe what their values are. So we'll get into the questions like, well, who's someone you admire? What about them do you admire? Maybe so for me, I'll give you my personal values. So authenticity is up there. Wisdom. I love wisdom. So it's knowledge, and then using that in a practical sense, like this conversation here, the things I've learned, being able to regurgitate that. So that's wisdom to me. Curiosity, following what I'm curious about. I get something, okay, I want to check that out, learn more about it. And then communities up there, and service. So my counseling practice, what I do here is service to others. And you already mentioned that. That's one of my values. I think it's really, really important. So figuring out what those values are, and then trying to use them to the best of your ability. So as far as to answer your question, certain things to stay away from, I don't know. I want to say the thing that immediately comes to mind is triggers. So with recovery, one of the big things that's going to cause people to relapse is the environment, the same friends, the same environment. That's going to pull you back into the old habits that you were getting yourself into. So redefining what that environment looks like, a healthier environment. And then really from there, I think it's individual. It's going to come down to what the individual's needs are. And then the other piece of that is not always, but oftentimes when people start using, there's some sort of unmet need. They're using it, like for alcohol, for example, a social lubricant. They have social anxiety or something. They don't feel like they can go have a conversation or have a good time without alcohol. So getting into that, figuring out why that is, and then redefining that for them going forward.
Yeah, I love that. You're talking a little bit about the actual therapy, the counselor process. I want to dive into that a little bit because I know for me, I got sober through a 12-step program and I love 12-step programs, but it was years later that I ended up going to therapy. And I wish I would have done that earlier, looking back, honestly, Dakota, because I think a lot of times people say, well, now I'm sober, the rest of this stuff should figure out. But what I found out was a lot of the stuff that was behind alcoholism for me, there were other things behind it that didn't really have anything to really do with alcoholism, right? I mean, it led to it, it fed into it. They were partners in a way, but there were other things that were going on that I needed to kind of talk through and explore. How does it work with the therapist? What is that process like? Because I know a lot of people are afraid. And I'll tell you, Dakota, I think a lot of people and I've heard this a lot in sober groups, 12-step groups. Hey, I'm afraid I'm sober now. Maybe I've made it sober a year, 2 years, 3 years. Now, if I go into therapy and I know I don't have a purpose, but if I'm trying to find my purpose, is this going to blow up my whole life? And then I'm going to be back to where I was at.
Yeah, so just to kind of speak on what you just talked about, that you started with 12-step, and I'm a big fan of 12-step. It's worked for a lot of people. My favorite podcast, other than this one having the honor of being on this one, is the Rich Roll podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but yeah, phenomenal 12-step guy, just always talks about it in his podcast, and I listen to it almost every day. So it works for some people, and that's the same with therapy. It's a tool, and you only should use tools so much as they work, and that's what I discuss with my clients. So therapy is a tool, and eventually you'll get to a point where therapy might not be working for you anymore, and that's okay. And then maybe you stick with a 12-step. So it's really figuring out what works for you. So as far as therapy, where I see sort of an advantage, it's the individual one-on-one focus. Whereas 12-step, you're in a group, and there are advantages to that. The sense of not feeling alone. There's other people going through it, and that's great. And that's something I'll reinforce when I'm working with clients. You're not alone. Like, you're not the only addict in the world, but it gives me the ability to really tailor the interventions to the individual person, because it really is individual when it comes to therapy. What do they need, and figuring out what that is, and then working with them to meet those needs.
Let's talk about letting go of things that no longer work for you, because I think this is a big part of finding your purpose. I know I had things that I thought were my purpose. And when I finally kind of dialed in and got sober and started doing a lot of the work that you're discussing, I found out, what, this no longer works for me. These ideas, these thoughts of what I have no longer work for me. But it was a long process, honestly, of being able to let go, because I was, honestly, Dakota, I was invested in those. Yeah. I was invested in those frameworks. I thought they worked. I had invested in them. So I kind of had a sunk cost kind of view on it, right? I put so much into it. If I just go a little bit further, this idea, this thought, this way of life is going to work for me. But clearly it wasn't. How do you go about that process of letting go? Not only finding new things of purpose, but just letting go of that stuff that just doesn't work for you anymore.
Yeah, I love that question, because that's another thing that I talk about constantly with clients, is being able to let go. And I like to use something, it's more of Eastern philosophical versus Western. I love Eastern strains of thought with this paradoxical thinking, right? So it's not this or that, maybe it's this and that. And this concept of letting go, I think it comes back to the concept of self as well, because a lot of people, when they think of themselves, they think about this past version of themselves. And that might not align with who they are today. This concept, you're constantly in conversation with change. So when you're holding on to something too tightly, it doesn't allow you to become. So the quote I mentioned earlier, become who you are. You can't become who you are if you're holding on to these preconceived notions of self, or like you mentioned, tools. Just because it worked in the past, you're not the same person. It might not work today, right? So tools are only as effective so much as they're effective. That's 12-step, that's counseling, that's a fitness watch tracking your heart rate. Could be anything, any tool that you use and implement in your everyday life. If it's no longer serving you, then it's letting it go and going without it, or finding a new tool to fit your needs. So understanding what your needs are in the given moment and aligning the tools to that.
That's great. I love that, because being able to let go allows you to actually bring new things into your life, right? To kind of like, it allows you to bring in new perspectives. Can your purpose change in your life? You know, like me at 55 isn't me at 28, right? Like, you know, I'm much older than you, but like you know, I don't. My purpose has shifted kind of throughout my life. There's a through thread. Right. There is a little bit of a through, right? But the way in which I practice that purpose and the way that I do that has changed. There was a lot of fear when I let go of one business purpose that I had, you know, Dakota, and I was like, you know what, this needs to shift a little bit, because I'm just not there in my life anymore. I'm gonna go somewhere else with it, to practice that purpose somewhere else.
Yeah.
Is that okay to do? Because I know that's something that I struggled with. Can your purpose shift and change as you grow as an individual?
Yes. And Viktor Frankl talks about it in Man's Search for Meaning, and his therapy that he developed, logotherapy. Meaning can oftentimes be very fleeting. So you think you got it and it changes, and that's what you were kind of describing. And also, as you were kind of talking, I was thinking about, again, Eastern train of thought, Buddhism. Buddhism talks about attachment, and it said attachments are the root of suffering. So being unable to let go and become who you are is holding you back, and it's causing some of the symptoms you're probably experiencing: anxiety, things like that, excessive worry. So it really is that attachment piece, and I've seen that come up in attachment, meaning being unable to let go. You've probably felt that. It seems like you were describing that inability to let go, causing some symptoms, and it's really holding you back and hindering you. So yes, I would say one, meaning does change. Oftentimes it is fleeting. That's a paradox of it. It's not one thing, and it's an active process. So constantly seeking it out.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting, what I always find interesting, in when I've worked with other people and helped them get sober, and you know, either in a 12-step group or a coach or something like that, when I work that, what I notice is as people's values change, they start to get a purpose, they start to work for something. The cost of going back to using drugs and alcohol, to risking that, even though they know it's not going to work, right? The ability to do that becomes way less viable in their life, because they actually have something to lose, right? You actually have something to lose. You're like, you can kind of see it going. And the interesting thing that I always find interesting, I don't know if you see this, you know, in counseling, is sometimes when I'm working with people, I'll notice that they're the last to really view that their values have shifted. Until you point it, like, I'm always, I'm about, okay, find out what you want to do, work, right? Into action, make it happen. But sometimes I don't slow down to actually evaluate what's actually going on, to see the shift. I'll sit and complain about it, you know, like the other day I talked with a buddy of mine, you know, in recovery, and he's just like, damn it. He's like, man, like, you are being super productive. Like, you did more in a week than I did in a month. Right. But I don't see it. I don't see these shifts. Isn't that some of the value that you get with therapists, to be able to point that out, 12-step groups and stuff, to be able to say, it's like, hey, you know what? Things are moving. Because I think a lot of times in recovery, if we don't see it, we're like, well, you know, like, you're either physically sober or you're not physically sober, right? But values and purpose and things like this, it's something that grows, right? It's like, you're not necessarily going to see that shift immediately.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And you mentioned in therapy, and that is part of the job of the therapist, to recognize growth and acknowledge that. But you had that with a friend. So friends can do that for you too, just getting that other perspective, right? So just using an anecdote, say you did something and you were super worried about it. You thought it was some sort of criminal activity and you were afraid. Your fear was like a 10, and you talked to a lawyer friend of yours and he's like, no, that's minor. That's a 2.5 out of everything I've seen. So getting that other perspective to really get that, really higher level perspective on what happened. So it can be a therapist. Yeah, sure, I do that. But it can be a friend, your friend that did that for you, and it seemed helpful to kind of recognize the progress and growth that has happened. And I think we all get into that habit of kind of not really recognizing the growth and kind of focusing on the negatives. Well, I still can work on this. I need to get better at this, rather than, giving yourself a pat on the back, which I think is extremely important. And that comes with self-esteem, self-worth, and things like that. Yeah.
One of the old beliefs that I had, and one of the values that shifted me, Dakota, in recovery is I kind of had this Western view of people don't change. Like I grew up around people, and there was a very big message. It's like, look, people are people. People are good. They're bad. They're not going to change that at the core. As I got into recovery and I saw this, what recovery is good is if you're a transformation junkie, recovery is great, because you see people and I would say, oh man, this person's not going to change. This person's a criminal. They're homeless because they want to be, right. Mm-hmm. Like they're all this, it's never going to change. And I saw people change drastically, and I got to know them, and they really like somebody who would be robbing liquor stores one day, 2 years later, people are giving them the keys to their house and they're house sitting for them, right? Like I saw this, and that was something that shifted in me to say, well, you know what, that value of people don't change, maybe doesn't work for me anymore, right? Like this perspective doesn't. But I know there's a lot of people that are listening to this, Dakota, and final thoughts from you is they're saying, you know what, man, I've tried to shift my values. I've tried to come up with a purpose. I've tried this a bunch of times. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't work for me. Maybe I'm just not capable of doing this.
Yeah.
What would you say to people that are listening that are maybe had this issue?
Yeah, it's just kind of addressing that mindset. Why are you thinking that way, right? So you mentioned Western strains of thought about personality being stable, and for the most part it is. But people in Eastern cultures would kind of laugh at that concept. So, for example, in Western cultures, we're big on the personality tests, things like that, and we assume that that's going to be stable and that's going to be who someone is. But Eastern cultures oftentimes don't really believe in personality tests, because who they are with their friends is going to be different than who they are with their elders. They're going to act completely different. And it goes back to something I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. We're constantly in conversation with change, and it's up to you whether you want to change in the right direction, going up and improving your values and your sense of being, and getting to that point of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that self-actualization piece, that transcendence piece. But it takes work, it takes progress. So it really comes down to the individual to seek help if they need it, to do the reading, do the things that they need to do to send them in the right direction while they're in that conversation with change, because we really always are, although we don't always recognize it.
I love that conversation with change. Dakota, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We're going to put links, guys, on how you can reach Dakota if you want to get in touch with him and work on finding your purpose. You want to talk about your values. I think Dakota is a great resource for you. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Dakota, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Sometimes addiction recovery can be a lonely battle, but you don't have to fight it alone. At Recovered Life, we're dedicated to helping you live your best recovered life. And that's why we're inviting you to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. Every week, we carefully curate exclusive content from leading minds in addiction recovery, mental health, and all things important to the recovery lifestyle. Stay in the know with the latest news about addiction and get exclusive invitations to special recovery-focused events, and explore insights tailored to support recovery from alcoholism, drug addiction, codependency, disordered eating, dysfunctional family dynamics, gambling, and so much more. With our newsletter, each week becomes an opportunity for growth, healing, and taking a step closer to the life you deserve. Take your first step towards a brighter future today. Go to recoveredlife.us and subscribe for free. Sign up now at recoveredlife.us.